Good morning and welcome to the 8th Annual O'Bannon Institute. I'd like now to call on our Chancellor, John Whikehart, for his opening remarks. Chancellor Whikehart.
Thank you and good morning. As Keith said, welcome to our 8th Annual O'Bannon Institute for Community Service. When I think back to the first institute and how much this has grown over the years, if you remember, those of you who were with us, the first year we launched the O'Bannon Institute for Community Service, it was a one-day event. It was a Friday just like today. We had panel discussions. Mrs. O'Bannon, who's been with us at each of our events, was kind enough to be our guest in the afternoon so we could have a conversation with her. And since that time, this has grown to be a three-day event. Beginning on Wednesday when we honored the service of our faculty and staff and students and community partners. Yesterday, which was a day of service, and we had over 100 faculty, staff, and students who volunteered their time to various nonprofit organizations in the community. Last night we had a wonderful fundraising dinner, and our guests were James Carville and Mary Madeline. We had about 400 people at the fundraising dinner. And now we're back here today for our day of engaging our community in some wonderful discussions. And the theme this year is getting back to basics, jobs, education, and it says community, but I think actually what you'll discover is this third panel this afternoon is really about civility and civil discourse and what's going on in our nation and our country, and we'll have a nice discussion about that. Let me first of all thank our event sponsors. And our event sponsors have made it possible for us not just to have this 3 days of activity, but for us to continue our civic engagement goal throughout the year. And joining Linda and I as event sponsors this year and again this year are the City of Bloomington, Markey's Rental and Staging, the Bloomington Economic Development Corporation, the Herald Times, Jefferson Shreve, the IU Credit Union, Cook Medical, and Bloomington Ford, and I would like to express my appreciation to all of them for being event sponsors. All of you are special to us, but I do want to point out that we have some people with us. After all, I'm an employee of the college, and I would be foolish not to recognize, first of all, the man who employed me, former President Gerald Lampkin and his wife Louise, who are with us today. One of our newer staff people walked the Lampkins in this morning and asked President Lampkin if he knew where Lampkin Hall was. And he said, yes, it's named for me. I think I can find it. And the chairperson of our Regional Board of Trustees, Connie Ferguson. Thank you, Connie, for being with us again. Let me take a quick moment and talk to you about our civic engagement goal. It's very unique at our campus. Civic engagement as a goal, as a strategic goal, is not universally found in the college system, and we certainly have it as a recognized and stated goal of our campus. And we use the metaphor of a three-legged stool when we talk about civic engagement. The first leg of that stool is volunteerism, and how we promote volunteerism among our faculty, staff, and students, and how we model it by our own behavior. The second leg of that stool is service learning, and how we integrate service learning into our teaching curriculum and provide students with opportunities for project-based experiences in our community in support of nonprofit organizations. And the third leg of that stool is how we use our institutional resources to engage our community. And that's in fact what the O'Bannon Institute is about. That's one example of that. But I want to give you a little information to try to put a different perspective on this and perhaps help with an understanding of what we mean when we talk about volunteerism and service learning. This year, the faculty, students, and staff on this campus donated 18,623 hours to our community in volunteer time to nonprofit organizations. And we can literally put a dollar figure on that we didn't create. There's a group called the Independent Study Group that's a policy group that puts an actual dollar figure on what volunteerism means to local communities. And so in many ways this is economic development and the support of economic development in our community. And when that figure, when the Indiana dollar figure is applied to those 18,000+ hours, it was a contribution by our faculty, staff, and students to our local community of over $635,000 last year in volunteerism to our local community and to nonprofit organizations in our community. And that's our goal. In fact, we want to see that figure grew by $200,000 over the previous year. And so next year we want to see that grow even more. Service learning, to give you an example of that, our accounting program, students in the second year of our accounting program who are taking a tax preparation course, in a partnership with the City of Bloomington and the Internal Revenue Service, go out into our community, meet with qualifying individuals, and prepare tax returns for them. This year they prepared over 570 tax returns for individuals in our community who qualify for that program. And in federal tax return dollars returned to those individuals in our community, $951,000 in federal tax returns this year to individuals who qualify for that program. And when you add state tax returns in, it was over $1 million. So that's over $1 million that went back into the hands of qualifying individuals in this community to put back into our local economy in terms of tax return dollars. And students come back from that experience, and the faculty tell us that they could not invent or create the case studies that students get to deal with in that program. And then they come back and they reflect on that. And sometimes their reflection is, I don't ever want to be a tax return person. But you know, there's value to that too. I remember when I was a college student and it dawned on me I wasn't going to be an astronaut. So, you know, those are all part of the learning experience. You know, we discover what we're not going to do as well as what we want to do. So that's an example of service learning, and we're very proud of that, and we're very proud of that contribution that our students, faculty, and staff make. I mentioned the fundraising dinner last night, and our guests last evening, James Carville and Mary Madeline, are not able to be with us today, but they were kind enough to video a greeting for you, and so I think with that we'll show the video.
James and I couldn't be with you this morning, but we wanted to take a moment to send our greetings to those of you attending the Friday 2011 O'Bannon Institute activities.
Mary and I enjoyed the opportunity to speak to your fundraising dinner and meet supporters of the Ivy Tech Community College Bloomington. What a glorious event the O'Bannon Institute is, bringing diverse people together to discuss topics of interest on the national, international, state, and local levels.
We were delighted to have an opportunity to meet Chancellor John Whikehart and Mrs. Judy O'Bannon. It takes visionaries to see what can be accomplished by events like the O'Bannon Institute. The very fact that this is your 8th annual event is indicative of the success of this program. James and I wish you all the best in the future for the O'Bannon Institute.
Thanks to all of you for your wonderful display of Hoosier hospitality. Now, as chairman of the 2013 Super Bowl in New Orleans, we want to be sure that you come on down and see us. That will be right after Indianapolis successfully hosts its 2012 version.
I suggested to them last evening that since Indianapolis is hosting the Super Bowl in 2012 and then New Orleans in 2013, that we could just play home and away for those 2 years. So the Colts could play the Saints in 2012 in Indianapolis and then go to New Orleans the next year and they could play each other again. So we'll see how that works out. It is now my pleasure to introduce Judy O'Bannon for her remarks to you this morning. Judy is currently the host of the WFYI TV produced television series Communities Building Community. She has served on numerous boards and commissions throughout the state, including having served as, she's currently a trustee of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, has been the executive director, served on the executive board of directors of the Historic Landmarks Foundation, has served as a trustee of the Indiana State Museum, a member of the Indiana Arts Commission, past chair of the Old Centrum Foundation in Indianapolis for the historic Old North Side, founding member of the Partners in Politics. As First Lady, her contributions to the state are well known. Among my favorites was her championship of literacy and reading programs for elementary school students. And I recalled last night when Linda and I lived in Kokomo, and Linda taught first grade and took a group of first graders to the governor's residence as part of a program that Mrs. O'Bannon was sponsoring. And as I said earlier, she has been with us each year of the 8 years we've had this event. She's a graduate of Indiana University, graduating Phi Beta Kappa. She has 3 children, 6 grandchildren, one of whom was with us last night. Ladies and gentlemen, an Indiana treasure, Judy O'Bannon.
welcome. Welcome to all of you. And thanks so much for coming. I always am just really genuinely awed by this. When I look at the quality, capacity of everyone who comes as a participant, and when I look over here at the presenters, I want to get them all in the corner and just pick their brains for the rest of the day. I would have to say in quiet to John, how do you do it? You're on a roll, fella. And when you're on a roll, you don't let go. You just keep going. And when I try to figure out how did he get on this roll, I first of all have to know that I've always come and heard the best programs. And I've been with people who genuinely wanted to know what the people were considering and discussing and ask good questions. So the next year, people hear about that and they want to come, don't they? So go home and talk about it, would you please? But more than that, it comes from the foundation he described, the culture of Ivy Tech Community College, why they were here, philosophically why it was seen as an opportunity in our state, and the services they provide. You don't just go to school to get a degree. You don't just learn about something that will never be applied, but it looks good on a resume. You go to learn a skill, to build a confidence, a talent base within yourself that you can use when you fit out into the community. And then, here at Ivy Tech, they provide those opportunities for students to really use those talents and skills and try them out. It's a foundation that comes complete with the Ivy Tech Community College system. And when he describes that so many people over the last day committed to their community and what they did, think of the stuff they did. Everything from cleaning out dog kennels at the Humane Society to reading to children in Head Start and small groups, all across the board. And when you do that, when you reach out and share what you've got in you with somebody else, you're never the same. You're never the same. So many times, and many of you have heard me say, that I think to life we all come with skills, with talents, with resources, with gifts. We all have gifts. Even that little kid sitting there trying to hear a story at Head Start has a gift for you. Everyone has a gift. And everyone has a need. I'm looking at a pretty smart bunch of people here. I'm looking at people who have been involved, who are competent, who feel confident of themselves. But if we listen to your story closely, we would find that every one of you has a need. And it's when we bring those gifts and those needs, whoever we are, we bring those gifts and those needs together. We feed each other. We really feed each other. And the community is healed. We have a lot of things going on in our world right now. It's changing fast. We're going places we've never heard of before. Some of it's uncharted course. And we need to heal. And we need to talk about the fact that in many cases we are broken as individuals and as a gathered community. When we talk today about jobs, education, and community or civility, all of those right now have raw wounds that we're all aware of. And I think it's so important, it's vital, it's urgent that we talk about them together in context. They're so intertwined, aren't they? It's a complex world, and more we are aware we're one with all. And all our systems and institutions and philosophies are all intertwined. And you tweak one, and it vibrates over here. When I thought about where we were today, I came up with a litany like you would in your mind. You know, the recession's sort of doing better, but still, groceries are up, gas is up, but building starts aren't, jobs aren't. It's a tough time. We think we're over the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and yesterday what? An aftershock. And nuclear systems are still in wonder. Our confidence in them as a power source is totally shaken by an earthquake. We have uprisings in foreign countries. Some of them we shout and cheer at people taking hold of their lives and risking and saying, I want to be part of this. And part of it is alliances that are very complex, that help us have a society that we can understand enough that diplomatic and political systems can operate. Little ethnic wars, turf wars, old tribal systems are erupting in places we here in the United States don't even understand. Citizens turned out at the polls. And yes, they made their voice heard. Conservatives and incumbents were not on the same page, and liberals like me were out to pasture. And we all look at that and say, where are we going? Well, sports teams have had their day in the sun. iPhones and reading gadgets have been upgraded. But at the same time, our legislature is going through a whole big change and turmoil. They're talking about basic human freedoms and opportunities. Who should get to go to school where? Who should get health care and under what conditions? Who should get to marry whom? Who should get to live here or not live here? Who gets to negotiate about job conditions and who doesn't? And all this in the context of less money to go around and value judgments about what's important in this complex internet that we have to mesh and work out. And now we're waiting for tomorrow's paper to tell us whether the federal government is going to even open its doors, and whether you can get a small business loan or go to a federal park. Yep, in the last year, festivals have been a part of our lives. We have gathered together and said hurrah, and laughed, and celebrated. But we've also stood shoulder to shoulder and wondered and worried and questioned and cried. That's what communities do. And when I do that, I've gotten to the point in my life when I look at all this going on all the time, and I say, what is all this about? And my big question has come around to, so what? So what we had a storm? So what there is a recession? So what people are looking at basic human rights and freedoms? So what? That's the question. So what? This is going on in our community. What does that mean about where our community goes tomorrow? Because it's all about tomorrow. So what that you came today on a Friday and sat here on one of those spring days when every leaf has its moment and pops, and there's not a window that we can see out much in this room. So what? Is tomorrow going to be different because you came here today? Because if we just expand our thinking, like you develop words in a crossword puzzle, where do they go? As we listen today to these outstanding thinkers and participants who are going to come up here and share their knowledge, as you put in your questions and listen to answers, you ask yourself, how's my life going to be different tomorrow because I came? So what that I heard that? And how is our community going to profit by this experience? Thank you so very much for sharing this mind pool we've got here today. I can't wait to hear the real guys. Come on.
We couldn't have a finer supporter of the O'Bannon Institute than Mrs. Judy O'Bannon, who's been with us since day one and told me again this morning she wouldn't miss it for the world. Thank you, Judy, for doing this. We really, really appreciate it. If you're from this area, you certainly know our moderator of our first panel because you saw him on television for years, whether you watched Channel 6 or Channel 8 or Channel 59. You know Ken Owen. And Ken left the television business, and now he's the media director at DePaul University, his alma mater. And ladies and gentlemen, our first panel on Making Jobs, Job 1. Let me introduce our moderator, Ken Owen.
Keith, thank you very much. And thank you. Good morning to you all. It's great to be here today, and we've got a terrific panel for you. I think we're talking about something that is on the minds of everybody in Indiana and certainly everybody in America these days, and that is jobs. I first of all want to thank Keith Klein for inviting me. I'm so thrilled to be here this morning. Chancellor Whikehart, who is a wonderful ambassador for Ivy Tech and the many, many great things that Ivy Tech is doing. And of course, Judy O'Bannon, who is perhaps the dearest person in the state of Indiana for all the things she does for us culturally and spiritually. Judy, I'll never forget being with Frank the night he won the governor's seat in the Hyatt Regency and the look on his face that night, and that's something I will never forget. That was too fun. That was too fun. And this is right up there. So anyway, Making Jobs, Job 1 is what we're going to discuss this morning, and I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel going from my left all the way to the end. First of all, Steve Ferguson is here. Steve is the chairman of the board of Cook Group, which is one of Indiana's great companies. Steve, thank you for joining us this morning. Lauren Damme is to Steve's left. Lauren is the policy analyst with the New American Foundation's Economic Growth Program. Lauren, thank you for being here. We're also joined by Greg Goodnight, the mayor of Kokomo, Indiana, and Jerry Boyle, who's the managing director of economic development for the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago's Community Development and Policy Studies Division. Please welcome our panel this morning. And I thought we'd start with just a brief lay of the land. The March unemployment numbers, which are now, I think, about 7 or 8 days old, but currently the United States unemployment rate is at 8.8%, which is the lowest in 2 years. That's the good news this morning. The latest report we have for Indiana is the same number. The February number, we don't have a March number, is 8.8%. 13.5 million Americans were unemployed as of the March report. And since the labor market peaked in January of 2008, between 2008, January 2008 and February 2010, the labor market had lost 8.8 million jobs. An additional 1.5 million, I think, were added to the economy last month. But some economists are saying it will be 3 to 8 years before we actually get back to where we were based on the growth in the labor market and the economic conditions. So I'd like to start by going around, and Steve, we'll start with you, just a brief kind of lay of the land from your perspective. What is the job situation right now in the state and in this country?
Well, starting with I think this area in Cook, the most
difficult thing is still, and I think you'll hear this from Indiana business across the state of Indiana, is find qualified employees. We have not only a tremendous income gap because of education, but we have a tremendous qualification gap, and I think that is probably the biggest challenge all the way from the device manufacturing to the hospitality down at the French Lake Resort. When you look at the national figures, you gave figures, but it goes much deeper than that in terms of those who are no longer looking for a job or those who are underemployed. And then the second part of it from prospect is that as the economy turns and you see the manufacturing section leading that return, and it is I think a real positive thing. Over the last decade or so, our manufacturing jobs have gone down in terms of number, and they've gone down in Indiana. But you really need to have value-added jobs, and manufacturing, I think, is someplace that we ought to put our emphasis, as the governor has, and in this country, and I know the president is also trying to move it up on his agenda, but manufacturing is a tremendous value added, and we can be competitive in this country. We just need to put our efforts into doing that.
Lauren, Damme, people look at these numbers and they say, you know, the economy seems to be turning the corner, things are getting better, but the feeling on Main Street is that we're still kind of spinning our wheels in some sense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, while the GDP has recovered, people haven't felt jobs recovering, and as Steve said, the numbers go much deeper than that. There are 5 workers right now for every open job, so even if we filled every job in the U.S., there would still be 4 workers for every job. So people really don't feel like their jobs are recovering because they don't have jobs. And as Steve said, the numbers go much deeper. Many more people are unemployed if they don't have college degrees. It depends on your ethnicity. Unemployment for Black Americans is more than double, I think, the national unemployment rate. The unemployment rate for people who don't have high school degrees is more than double the national unemployment rate. And actual effective unemployment, which includes people who have either stopped looking for a job or who are working part-time for economic reasons, is I think 17 or 18%. So actual unemployment feels a lot different than 8.8% unemployment. And all the growth that we're seeing in any, I mean, this is known as the jobless recovery, but any growth that we're seeing is in low-wage jobs, not in good jobs, not in manufacturing jobs, which have gone overseas. It's in the home health care sector and personal care.
Mayor Goodnight, you see the human toll probably more than anyone else on this panel, just because you're dealing every day with citizens in Kokomo, which historically has been a place that has really suffered the blows of economic downturns. What's your lay of the land?
Well, if you're not familiar with Kokomo, Kokomo is about 50,000 residents, very heavily reliant on manufacturing. I tell people we probably were hit as hard, if not harder, than any community in the Midwest. During this last recession. Mainly, it's not just manufacturing, our main manufacturing is automotive, which is the sector that was hit the hardest. So I see that too. Things have turned around. It's going in the right direction. I feel it's obviously not as fast as I would like and as most people would like, but I do think it's important that we do invest in manufacturing. There are those, the benefit jobs that come from that, from the suppliers, and it trickles down to retail and those things. So I think we need a national policy that does focus on manufacturing.
Jerry?
Well, I have to preface my remarks with the fact that any opinion you hear is mine and not necessarily the Federal Reserve Board of Governors or the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. And by the way, my wife and my daughters would share the opinion that my opinion is not necessarily theirs either. I'm also not an economist, but I'm surrounded by world-class economists on a daily basis, so I know just enough to be a little bit dangerous. But clearly there are a couple of patterns here that are going in opposite directions in terms of the overall lay of the land. Several of the key indicators are clearly improving. GDP has improved. The employment rate is headed in the right direction. The markets seem to have healed themselves. The banking industry seems to be picking up again. But the reason people don't feel it yet is precisely as Lauren said, the jobs aren't returning yet. There's still quite a bit of uncertainty about what the price of your home is going to be 6 months from now, a year from now. So there is that instability in the market. And then the geopolitical upheaval around the world is causing even more uncertainty. Prices are rising on some of the key things that we need to buy every day. So it's that uncertainty that still exists in the system that makes it difficult for us to sort of look at those more positive trends and understand to what extent we're really headed in the right direction.
Well, we're here today to talk about the role of government in creating jobs as well as the job picture overall. And I can almost remember being a young reporter. It's been a long time, but back in the 80s, when it just seemed like every time there was a job development, a job announcement in this state or anywhere else, it was attached to an incentive package. And there was a period, I think, where citizens would say, why is the state, why is the city, why is my community doling out dollars to lure companies into town? We can talk about those packages which still exist and how I'm sure the competition for those, Mayor Goodnight especially probably can speak to how much competition there is out there for the jobs that do appear. But we're coming now out of a period where we had the stimulus package, and there's a lot of debate on where we'd be without the stimulus package, what it's done, the precedents it's set for the future. So let's just have an open-ended discussion about the role of government in creating jobs. How far should government go? Is government going far enough? Has government crossed any lines? And I'll let anybody jump in who'd like to. Steve?
You want me to start?
Please.
I think there are two sides to that. I think government needs to stay out of the way. But obviously the first question that anybody located in Kokomo or Bloomington or any place can look is there a qualified workforce. If you don't get past that test, then you aren't going to go any farther. Then the incentives come into play, but there's another side of that, and I'm sure the mayor would like to address that too. It's a question of having a site that's ready, because people make a decision, and when you go, long discussion times and procedural points are very difficult, and that is something that you aren't looking. So, for instance, where you've got a new facility in Canton, Illinois, where Bill Cook was originally from, but in terms of having a site ready, the city administration, etc., will be extremely helpful carrying the ball to make sure that everything was done and you're up and running and have a plant open in less than a year's time. We also, you said 4 out of 5. We opened with 30 jobs. It'll build to 300, but as you gradually train and build up, but we had 1,000 applications for those 30 jobs. So I think from that standpoint, it is really important not only for government to be helpful and to have the incentives, which get down to competitiveness, but it's also the intangible of being able to move forward rapidly, because if you don't open that plant for another 6 months, that's a tremendous difference. And so those things are important. I think the second place that we see it primarily with FDA. And if the regulatory climate is such that you don't have endpoints, that you don't have rules that you can follow and know that you meet them at that point in time, you have some predictability and assurance as to the approval of the device. Then you go to other jurisdictions where you do and introduce your devices there. Once you introduce them there, then you have a tendency for the manufacturing to stay there. So I think in those two cases, incentives are important, but they're not the crucial question when you come down, at least from a medical device manufacturer's point of view.
And we want to get around to education at some point, because obviously that's a key component in terms of the workforce and who finds jobs, who's employable, where jobs wind up. Mayor Goodnight, I'm going to toss it to you just because I would sense there's a real push and pull from your constituency in terms of, we want jobs, bring us the jobs, but be careful with our funds. We don't want our taxes to go up. Don't throw money at the problem.
Right, and Steve's right. There's a lot of moving parts to this. It's incentive packages. Sometimes it's road extension, access to sewers. I know a lot of times they do want to make sure that things are in place, the proper zoning, whether it be a tech park or an industrial park of some sort, so they can cut through the red tape. We obviously had a lot of challenges. Our unemployment at one time, just in the last couple of years, hit about 23% for a few months. And when the financial availability for a lot of our small businesses, it was frozen. We had small businesses that could not get their loans. We took our economic development income tax funds and we created a local pool. We called it our Reach Higher program to kind of bridge that gap for 6 to 9 months for low or no interest loans to a lot of our local employers so that they could get through this recession. So we took that upon ourselves as government to step in and and it was very difficult because a few years ago the legislature allowed municipalities to take their economic development income tax money and use it for just about any reason that they would see fit to subsidize the general fund and use it for general operating expenses. And there was a lot of pressure when I had to make some decisions on employee benefits, and we even laid off a lot of city employees and did job combinations and things, so we didn't get this reputation of a city that was not a viable city. There was a lot of public pressure to take those economic development, that pool of funds, and use it to keep from laying people off. Well, we made the hard decisions, kept the money, but we were able to use that to support small businesses in the community. And that was, I feel like, our administration taking a proactive approach as opposed to waiting till these businesses had closed. We were able to offer that incentive, and we did have multiple applicants. So.
Lauren, how has that shifted over the years, the role of government involved in creating jobs, keeping jobs, finding jobs, bringing them to communities?
Well, I guess I look at this from more of a federal level than from a local or state level. I think there are two really clear scenarios in which the federal government should step in to be involved with job creation. One is for all of the public goods that the market underprovides, like education, healthcare, roads, other types of infrastructure, information infrastructure, et cetera. Because the market is never going to fully provide as much of those products and services that we want for social reasons. I mean, you want a workforce that is prepared. So if the private market isn't going to provide that, the government should provide those goods and services. And the second area in which I think that the federal government should step in is during downturns, because state and local governments, well, with the exception of Vermont, can't borrow, so they need to have balanced budgets. So the government, I think, has a really clear role in smoothing economic transitions and economic downturns for individuals by stepping in and having an active role in job creation, so that you don't have all these cuts in state and local budgets, which it means that they cut a lot of state and local jobs, which means that there's less demand in the economy, which means that private businesses cut more jobs, which means that there's less demand, and then you cut more jobs, so it's a downward spiral. So because the federal government has this capacity to borrow, the federal government, I think, definitively has a role in economic recessions.
And Jerry, obviously confidence was in the balance a couple of years ago. Getting back to that point where people feel like the home that they bought is at least holding the line and isn't sinking. Getting back to that point where we feel like we look at our stock portfolios and you're at least not seeing those enormous bad days we had a couple of years ago is a key thing. But moving forward, there still is this debate about the stimulus package, the bailouts, whether it was a good idea. And I don't know how far you can go being a Federal Reserve person, but if you could talk just a bit about the importance of the federal government stepping in at these key times and how unusual things were a couple of years ago when things were in their deepest malaise.
Well, again, let me start with the fact that, I'm not an economist. The role that I play in the Federal Reserve is in community development, and our role was created after passage of the Community Reinvestment Act back in 1977, which required financial institutions to lend and invest in all of the communities from which they drew deposits. And the reason behind that was no community can survive if access to credit is cut off. It's like cutting off blood flow through the arteries of the body. You have to have access to credit. And certainly from the perspective of the Federal Reserve, when we saw that flow of credit being restricted to different industry sectors and different parts of the economy, we took very aggressive action over the course of a couple of years to make sure that credit continued to flow so that the spiraling effect of what was going on in those markets didn't continue. We tried to stop that, and we've had some success with that. But certainly this is like we said earlier, just because some of the things are improving doesn't mean that everybody on Main Street and every homeowner that's looking to refinance a loan is getting what they need. So we're still working on that. And let me just put that in the context of small business lending. As the mayor pointed out, public officials in particular are sort of caught in a little bit of a trick bag, because if he's running for office, one of the things he's going to be asked is, what are you going to do to create jobs? On the other hand, people are going to say the government doesn't create jobs. And so there needs to be a little bit of a balance struck on the part of elected officials. And to your point earlier, it used to be part of industrial policy. When you were a reporter, I was in urban planning school, and the policy for economic development in this state was shoot anything that flies and claim anything that falls. And sometimes that was referred to as smokestack chasing, and it led to what clearly emerged as a dysfunctional competition between neighboring states who more often than not lost out on those big plants and that kind of thing. But they never worked together, so that if a plant located in Gary, Indiana, there would be a positive outcome for Illinois, but Illinois and Indiana never worked together, and to my knowledge, they still don't. And that's too bad. But at the more local level, when you look at local elected officials and local community banks who are trying to address these issues of access to credit for their communities, clearly there are a lot of efforts to address these issues at the local level, which combine the expertise of the community bank, the knowledge of the communities the community bankers bring to these things, with the limited resources that local governments can bring to bear. And there's an entity up in Chicago who realized this, because one of the things that we need to look at for all of the resources that are available for small business development, if you look at any community, whether it's a large community like Chicago or a local community like Kokomo, chances are there are a lot of discrete different programs that have been designed to serve some element of small business development, whether it's at the startup stage or at the growth stage or providing financing for a merger or acquisition. Those are all very different approaches to what kind of credit is available. We had an entity in Chicago actually catalog all of the programs that are available for small business assistance, and they found 700 discrete programs, from the federal level to the state level to the local level to private foundations to community bank programs. And so if you're a small business, if Mr. Cook is a little smaller than he is today and looking for the right kind of financial assistance at the right time, and they go looking for the right kind of assistance while he's trying to run his business day to day, this is just too much. And the question is, do local communities have the infrastructure well developed and working together enough to be able to address the needs that Cook has in whatever the growth stage is? And by and large, based on what we have gathered in terms of qualitative data, the answer to that is no. Because just like I described with the states competing with each other, if you're a nonprofit, or too often if you're an institute of higher learning, there's not enough incentive to be working together. So everybody creates their own program so that they can say, here's what we have done to address that issue. Clearly what we need is more of the interweaving of all of the resources that are together. So back to the original question for the panel, whose job should be job one? I think what you would find is communities that have had success creating jobs are the ones where the civic and community leadership have come together and worked together on a common strategy toward a common goal, but where the infrastructure for assistance is sort of scattered, you have less success.
Thank you, Jerry. I want to point out to the audience, we have cards out on the tables. If you have a question, fill that out and wave it around. We'll have somebody come by and pick it up, because we'll be getting to the questions in a bit.
I might follow up a little
Please,
bit
Steve.
on Jerry's point, because it's very important. When Bill Cook started, You know, he could go down to the First National Bank and Don Hanson knew who he was. He was getting started, and also looked not only at who it was, but the benefit to the community. And over the years, we've lost the local banks. So that source of revenue that you refer to, and we have to find new systems to provide that. And there's always a lot of conversation about venture capital and angel investors, but you really need to have another source. And your point's very well taken. I think an important one for these startup and for the communities to have that both.
I imagine economic development efforts, aside from any incentive dollars that are involved, cost money. And I'd like to move on to another piece of the pie, and that is taxation. Obviously, we're at a time in our nation's history where people are looking very closely at the taxes they pay, perhaps complaining about them more loudly than they have in the past. And we'll get to education in a minute, because that's a big piece of this too. But as there's more and more pressure to keep taxes in check, or to make taxes perhaps lower than they have been, that puts pressure on people like Mayor Goodnight to provide the services that are needed in the community. And at some point, you know, you've got to start making decisions about what you do and what you do less of.
Well, I'm glad somebody recognizes that there is a lot of pressure, especially at the local level, because a lot of times we're hit with unfunded mandates from the federal level and sometimes from the state level, and there's no funding mechanism. And especially in a lot of cities, everybody wants us to do more with less. And everybody wants the same level of services they received last year and in the previous years. And but they really don't want, they want somebody else to pay for them is really
it's a game of musical chairs.
It is. And so I give the speech at Rotaries and at Kiwanis clubs that, you know, when you're in a city, especially like Kokomo right now, we have to make a lot of the right decisions. Our margin of error is very minimal. And so we do have to always evaluate. I mean, I've been in office for 3 years, and my timing was not really very good. I took over, in my first 9 months, Forbes magazine comes in and says it's one of America's fastest dying cities. And so, I mean, what do? You have to roll up your sleeves, and I feel like we came out of this recession very well by making a lot of the difficult decisions on what services we'll provide and how we're going to pay for them. But it's a constant reevaluation. I mean, I thought when I would come in, the first thing I would do is get out these maps and look at future development and all these things. And I spent the first year and a half trying to figure out how to make payroll and where we're going to do things. But I feel like, at least in our city, and I don't want to spend too much time on that, but we have been able to overcome those challenges by making the proper investment in investments in infrastructure. And keep in mind, when I mentioned automotive, Chrysler has 4 plants in Kokomo, 3 transmission plants and an aluminum casting plant. It is the largest employer, private employer, north of Indianapolis in the state of Indiana, and has about 4,700 employees, larger than any of the individual steel mills in Gary or any place else. And so it's a regional employer. And one of the things we've tried to focus on is quality of life issues. And the 2 things I talk about, and I talked about it in my State of the City speech just a month ago, were education, because Steve's right. If you want these high-paying, high-tech jobs, you need to have a high-tech workforce. And so we've really been stressing that and making sure that we make the proper investments in the infrastructure so that, I'm very proud to say that during this recession, all the tough things we've been faced with, property tax caps, this year's park budget, we increased it by 18% over last year's. And I would venture to say that's probably a larger increase than any city in the state of Indiana, or very close to it, if not. And so, that's part of it, is creating that climate for those small investment businesses and the entrepreneurs, and we've really been trying to focus on that. So.
And Steve, if you're looking at a location for a plant, obviously you're looking at a number of things: the workforce, the kind of people that you can hire, the infrastructure in that community, and as taxes are stressed, maybe the potholes aren't fixed as quickly. On the other hand, you also want to have a low tax rate, and so it's a tough time for everybody trying to figure out how this new paradigm works.
I have at least an hour's worth of comments on that. But I think from our perspective, and let me just go through some examples, and I don't want to say they're good or bad, so I don't take the fact that I'm just saying that they're there. Of course, you've got the local property tax situation, and then you've got the state in Indiana, and we've got one of the highest corporate tax rates in the United States. And then you compare our federal rate with Ireland at 12%, or Canada at 18%. And then with the health care legislation, there's about a $20 million tax imposed on Cook. And then if you do cap and trade, that's we'd use about $10 million worth of utilities a year. And if they say that's double, that's about another $10 million. And then you got the unemployment tax, because the fund is down and people are unemployed. So obviously companies that are not and have employees, then we've got to pick up the share, and that's another $1.5 million, and I go on. So it's the cumulative stack. And being an international company, that's your competitors overseas aren't seeing a lot of that. And so the impact of it is really affecting, it's not just the local decision, but then it becomes a state decision, as the point was made between states, then it becomes an international question. And so all these things are part of the consideration, and there was just a bill introduced the other last week, and I just got the figures on analysis. Well, it's a $100 million impact on us. So all that takes away from your ability to reinvest, to hire people, to do the good things that Cook does. But your tax question goes, as I say, I could spend an hour going through the detail of it, but it's an enormous impact, and one unit of government doesn't take account what the other's doing. And so the cumulative becomes really enormous.
Lauren, I saw you scribbling a minute ago, so I want to let you jump in, but I also wanted to ask you to touch on the notion of, if you don't have a college degree, if you don't at least have a high school diploma, how difficult it is to find a job in this already tough environment.
Yeah, sure. Just after the mayor's comments, I wanted to re-emphasize, I think that there's a role for the federal government to play in taking pressure off of state and local economies by paying for the goods and services that we don't want cut. We don't want our retirees eating cat food. We don't want education funds cut when we have employers complaining that people don't have the right skills. We want everyone to have access to healthcare and medical care, and that is actually a pressure that you can take off of businesses by not making it tied to your employer, by not making your health insurance tied to your employer. So I think that the situation with state and local governments cutting critically needed services is just atrocious, and really highlights the role. This recession, for me at least, has really highlighted the role that the federal government should be playing, in which it does play in most other advanced democracies. In terms of the difficulty of people finding jobs, this is something that if you can, please write to your congressman about, because people in DC are in this insulated bubble where DC has one of the highest education rates of the country, because people with bachelor's, master's, and PhDs move to DC, so people are really insulated from, and it's also almost a separate economy, so people in DC really have no idea about what it's like for people outside of the Beltway. So, I'm from Nebraska, for example, and even for me, I have a lot of friends in New York. Everyone knows someone who's unemployed. Everybody has a family member who's unemployed. If it's, a father, sister, brother, cousin, everyone knows someone. And people in DC really don't see that. When politicians are talking about cutting all of unemployment insurance, the federal contribution to state unemployment insurance funds, they have no idea about the impact that's going to have on local communities, because after you cut unemployment insurance for these people who've been out of their jobs for over 6 months, which is at a historic all-time high, by the way, people, like I said earlier, they don't spend any money in the community. And when they don't spend any money in the community, then the businesses cut jobs, or the businesses cut back, or the businesses go under. So, it's a really important. I think important that people tell their politicians what this is actually like for them as individuals.
If I'm a person with a high school diploma or not even a high school diploma, what's the unemployment rate in that category right now?
I'm not sure. Actually, I haven't looked at the March numbers, but I think that Stephen said it was something like 20%.
Yeah,
Is that what you
16
mentioned?
and 20.
16 to 20%. So I mean,
Yeah.
it's much higher than the
If
national
you're
average.
African American, that's at the top
Then it's
end,
like
and
25%.
So
I
it's
mean,
also, you
yeah.
know, I'm giving you an average overall.
Yeah, so I mean, you see for specific populations, and this is by geography as well as by education level and ethnicity, there are groups in the country that are hit much, much harder than this. I mean, than people understand, I guess. Like I said, again, in DC, in the DC bubble. But there are communities where people have, I mean, you said that you had 25% unemployment?
About a year and a half ago.
I mean, that's just incredible. And I mean, a quarter of your people are unemployed. And so people again, in the Beltway just really don't understand this concept of what day-to-day life is like with 25% of your population being unemployed.
And I had said, every once in a while I say something really smart. It's like maybe once a decade, something comes out of my mouth that's really smart. But I thought it was pretty smart at the time, and I said that I really thought in about 2008, 2009, it was kind of a Sputnik moment. And then I heard the president actually use my line. We must be telepathically communicating, which is cool.
That may be good or bad.
Well,
I'm
yeah,
not sure why.
we're not going to get into the politics thing here. We're having a nice free-form discussion about America and jobs and getting people back to work. But it does seem that in the context of everything we're talking about, that especially in the areas of science and technology, America has lapsed. That somehow we have not focused perhaps as much on those things as we did when Sputnik was in the news in the 50s and 60s, and there was the arms race and the fear that the Soviets were going to beat us at everything. I think as we examine our priorities going forward, and this is just me throwing this out as a discussion point, because it does seem we have this mixing bowl of issues. We've got taxation on one hand, people that think taxes are too high. Those same people would complain to Greg if the pothole wasn't fixed or if the stop sign was bent for 2 weeks. We have to prioritize as people what it is we want government to do, but at the same time, we have to develop a path going forward so that people are employable.
Just to touch on that, and I've said this a few times, and I don't know if it makes me very popular, but this, I look at this recession that we went through, and even though there are there's a lot of bad stories, individual, families, businesses, but I think it gives us a chance to reevaluate things. I think when I tell people, even though you have these horror stories individually, I think collectively, and bear with me, it may not be such a bad thing. Because we have a lot of people that built these, when the housing market collapsed, they built these 5-bedroom, these were middle-income people, 5-bedroom, 3-car garage, 4 SUVs, 6 flat-screen TVs in these houses, and they have this huge amount of square footage that they really didn't use. They thought everyone needed, 3/4 of an acre yard, and I mean, is that really what we need to be doing? Should we, and the more you create this urban sprawl, the more expensive it is for government to operate, to go pick up the trash, to send a police car out to the far reaches of your community. So hopefully I look at this and I'm hoping that nationally we have a little bit of a gut check and we reevaluate what's important, because now, because we've, all of us, including, I'm as guilty as anybody, we've kind of created this. Now we're looking at having to make some hard choices, such as education, and because we've spent so much to provide services in these outlying areas. So it's very interesting. And then when you look at, I always kind of joke around when I speak at places that a lot of people can't name their state senator, or they may not even know who their city council district member is, but they know all about Charlie Sheen and what's the number, Dancing with the Stars or whatever that is. And it becomes frustrating sometimes that maybe it takes difficult times to get people to really focus on what's important. And I'm hoping that maybe that that's if nothing else good comes out of this, maybe at least that might happen.
Jerry?
Well, again, I have to be careful when I give my opinion here, and at this point I would be inclined to speak less as a representative of the Federal Reserve and more inclined to speak as a father of 2 young daughters. And I say that with the obvious pride of a father who has gifted children, but I say that with the pride of a father who has children who have been identified as gifted by the system. And I have to tell you, I thought it was very compelling when Mrs. O'Bannon spoke this morning about the talent and the gifts of the child in Head Start. Are an incredibly compelling moment, even more so, I think, than the Sputnik moment. Because we have to ask ourselves the question every day about what that child is going to be 20 years from now. And in too many communities, and again, I have to say this is my opinion, not necessarily that of the Federal Reserve, et cetera, but last night's speakers, James Carville and Mary Matlin, it's the one time that they seemed to be unified in what they had to say, was that if you look at the kids who are being left behind, that is a display of the system just being broken. And we are compelled to find ways of addressing how we bring those people who are being left behind into the mainstream. They are latent economic entities that we are losing out on if we don't find ways to bring them into the mainstream. But also from my own perspective of 2 gifted daughters, I have to tell you that having been identified as gifted, the system has not kept up with providing a supply of seats for gifted children as they grow into high school. And as the mayor probably knows, if you have families like mine who have all of the options open to them and the school system isn't addressing the needs of my children, I'm going to find the community that will do that. And so that becomes another one of those things that everybody in the community, whether it's the business that needs the workforce, the parents that want nothing more than a great education for their children, or the local officials who need to find a way to keep an educated workforce and grow that educated workforce, we all come together as Mrs. O'Bannon said, what are we going to do for that child in Head Start right now? And how do we project her future 20 years from now?
Steve? There's a really good point here, and I think one of the startling things, I think for all of us in the room, but also from the manufacturing side, in Indiana we start out with about 80,000 kids going through the system. We graduate 60,000 of them from high school. So we turn 20,000 every year out. Our college degrees, and our educators here could correct me on this point, but I think we give about 15,000 college degrees every year. So we're spending more time, and so we'd like to see the resources go, and to the mayors and commissioners and everybody. One of the things when you look at it is to have City of Bloomington have a street department, Evansville have a street department, Monroe County have a street department, for each of them to have a planning commission, to go on and on and on. The duplicative services is what the objection is. It's not the potholes. We want the potholes filled. We just want to run efficiently, and we'd like the dollars to be spent wisely. Same with the educational system. If I was looking at Monroe County, I'd have preschool. I'd have every kid reading by the 3rd grade. I'd remediate, and I'd really put the pressure on making sure everybody graduated and were qualified to graduate. But that's where I'd put the money. If I was in Greene County, I wouldn't have 5 school districts, all having a superintendent and such or such or such. So I think from the business point of view, we all agree on what we want to accomplish. We want all these kids to succeed. I think our question is, are you doing it the most efficiently? Because if we don't do it the most efficiently, we aren't in business. Because there's a competitor out there that's going to say, hey guy, we're going to do it better, more effectively, etc. But government needs to have that same drive for efficiency and to accomplish and be held accountable for accomplishing. I could go on a long time, but that's another hour. So,
well, Lauren, as big as the unemployment numbers are, they don't account for the people that have just given up. And there are many, many people in this country and this state who have just looked at the situation for too long and have essentially dropped out of the job market, even though they're at an age where they need to work.
Yeah, there are, I'm not sure, like I said, it's something close to double. I'm not sure what the March numbers are on those who are marginally attached to the workforce, but I mean, there are millions and millions of Americans who have literally given up on looking for a job because they're disheartened. They've been looking for a year, they have applied to maybe thousands of jobs, and they really genuinely feel like there is no job out there for them. But I just wanted to touch on what you were saying about education and workforce preparation, to highlight the huge role that community colleges play and can play in American communities for preparing a workforce. I mean, for people who also may not have gone straight from high school into university, people who've earned their GED, or people who, like I said, didn't go straight into university, community colleges have a huge potential role to play in working with local employers to prepare their local workforce for working with, for example, Cook. I just wanted to put that out there since we're at a community college. But I think that community colleges are incredibly important, and that's something that our federal and state and local governments really need to look at as a huge potential resource for the country.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lauren. Greg wanted to jump in with one point.
Yeah, I think I just want to just piggyback a little bit on what Steve had to say about the role of government, and are we spending our limited tax dollars properly? And my politics, I'm a Democrat, but I did stand with the governor a few years ago with his government consolidation from the Kern and Shepard report, and I think that's where Steve was going with this. Is and I've tried to tell people I don't want to do the trustee's job. I've got enough to do. I don't want to deal with poor relief. But in places like Howard County, I don't know if we need 11 trustees dealing with separate, they have their own policies, their own criteria, their own bureaucracy. And the more we spend on these levels of government, the more we take up tax dollars that could go to education and the things, because people do want their potholes filled and they want their trash picked up. I understand that. And then when you look at it on a broader scale, I mean, even California, I think they only have 62 counties, and we have 92. And basically, we're going to a regional system, and I would assume big businesses aren't really concerned so much when they look at the larger picture, which township this business will be located in, or which school district, and things like that. And I see that in my county. We have 5 school corporations, and it's not just the cost of having 5 superintendents and 5 school boards and 5 school board attorneys and that level of bureaucracy, but they're not able, as demographics change and the population shifts, the school districts follow the old township lines. And so at one time we had 3 school corporations that had declining enrollment, one that had been somewhat stagnant and one that was growing. So while 3 school corporations are scrambling they've got empty classrooms and maybe even closing a school, you have another school corporation that's doing a $35 million expansion just in the other part of the county. And if you could manage those, where you shift those things and share resources for bus routes, and I mean, we have the situation, and I don't want to dwell on too much, where kids get picked up at their home, they drive through 2 different school corporations to get to the other one where they're actually attending. And so they spend an hour, those children have to spend an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening riding a bus while they're driving past other school corporations. So it is efficiency, and I think it's something that the legislature really, not to be too critical, but I think they really dropped the ball this year by not tackling some of those things.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We have questions from the audience, and Keith Klein will deliver them for us.
We have a lot of questions. The first one is the system broken or is society broken?
We'd like to take a crack at that.
Well, I'm up for election this year, so I'm not going to touch that one. I don't know who's watching in Kokomo, so go ahead.
Well, my first question would be which system, but I think that in the FDA's case, just taking that as an example, it's the system that needs to be updated, and I think that's true of what the mayor and I were talking about in government. It needs to be updated. We've come out of the trustee system that came out of the Constitution of Indiana, And that's when they had schools and roads and then did everything. And as we've progressed forward, we haven't made the adjustments, and then that's been true of government. So I think those types of things. I think in the education, and Owen's exactly right, that there's an enormous responsibility on the community college and Ivy Tech to retrain this workforce, and also directed towards that 20,000 that aren't graduating from high school. So there's a tremendous burden, and I think they do it very efficiently. I think if I was looking at an efficient organization, I'd look at this one and say, well, now that's money well spent. You know, I think it's an extremely efficient organization serving a lot of students and employers. But that's not true throughout our educational system. And so I think a lot of it is systematic. I think, and I give a lot of our former president of the institution when I was in the legislature in, what, 67, or, you know, back in the dark ages when he started, but he looked at that and built a very efficient system. And he started from scratch and he built that, and we're all reaping the benefits of that, and a lot of people. But I think and my response is it's the system. It's not necessarily society, and I think the responses we're getting in society and reaction, whether you're on the left or the right or whatever side, to what they see happening, and the system's driving that.
Don't we need to also have an honest dialogue as just individual taxpayers, politics aside, as to what we expect, what we want, what we value? I mean, it seems like whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or in the middle, I just have this metaphor in my head of a person that's been at the buffet all day eating chicken, and all of a sudden the chicken's gone, and they're complaining about, they've had 18 pieces of chicken, but I need my 19th piece of chicken. You know, we want government to do certain things, and we're very expecting that government's going to perform roles for us. But on the other hand, there's this hue and cry that taxes are too high and we need to cut there, and what do you cut? It seems with all the noise out there, we're not having that honest dialogue about what is the role of government, what do we want government to do for us, and you know, these taxes aren't just going into a black hole somewhere being burned.
I think that there's something to be said, as the mayor mentioned, about societal norms, about consumerism. But that consumerism has taken place in the U.S. because of the system enabling access to easy credit for things that people don't need. AIG was doling out loans for people who they knew couldn't pay them back, to buy gigantic houses, to buy their 6 flat screen TVs, to buy an extra car that they didn't need. So I mean, that's something that is part of the system. And the reason why that happened is because the federal government wanted to keep our economy going by enabling easy credit, because wages have stagnated for the past 30 years. Right now, or even prior to the recession, the wage of like a middle non-manager manufacturing worker was $5 less than it was 30 years ago, the real wage. So inflation and medical costs, this isn't even factoring in medical costs, but inflation and other things have eaten away our wages, and the government wanted to take the path of least resistance to have our economy continue. And for that reason, we've been consuming global goods, global cheaper goods from China, for example, and we have all these huge, from a macroeconomic perspective, global imbalances. Part of it is cultural, but the reason why that culture has been enabled is system, is our system.
We have a couple of questions here that kind of relate. One has to do with the skills that are lacking, and perhaps Steve and Greg Goodnight will have some answers on this. What kind of skills are lacking in local workforce to develop the needed skills to attract the industry? And then there's an implied question about cities not reaching consensus on the topic of encouraging plant sightings in their area. And that may or may not be a problem in Kokomo, but it is a matter of discussion in Bloomington from time to time.
Go ahead.
Sure. Well, Kokomo faces the education problem. We have those with a 4-year degree, we are behind the state average and the national average. And I think it goes even beyond that, even the high school level, not focusing enough on math and science. And when businesses do look at Kokomo, a lot of times they'll look at this as if the schools in Howard County are failing, and that's not the case. We're, at least in our little piece of the world, we really do have a quality education system, but our best and brightest, not too different than what they talk about as the state of Indiana, we face the brain drain. Our students leave, which we want them to do, to go off to college and experience and see the world and spend some time learning. But the goal is that they, in 6, 8, 10 years, they bring those things back to the community when they're really ready to settle down for good. And we're missing that piece because, like I say, we haven't maybe made a lot of the, for various reasons, not to point the finger, but maybe we just haven't made a lot of the right decisions. So, it's something that we experience as well, that, a lot of times that when they look at site selections, it's access to interstate highway, it is the education level in your community, all those zoning things go with, they're all pieces of the puzzle. And so we see it from time to time with businesses. We cut ourselves out before it really ever gets started.
Mm-hmm. Steve, the skill sets that you're looking for that may be lacking?
If you look, a few years ago, we were looking for 700 employees, and we had a job fair, so 1,000 showed up. And because we're in the medical device business, you have to have certain qualifications for here good manufacturing practice, which is approved by every place, in the U.S. and the government, and et cetera. So you have to have a system in place. So you start out and you need to have a high school degree. Well, that takes a big cut out of it because they don't have a high school degree. And then you get into background checks, and that takes another big cut. And then you get down, do you have the actual physical skills to do the work? And that takes another big cut. And because it's so much of the hand-eye coordination, the people that do those just have enormous hand-eye coordination issues. So you got education, the hand-eye, and the background checks, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really, when we got through, we had about 300 qualified, and by the time we got through with that, well, that with an older workforce like we have and people going through retirement, about all we did was stay even. And you can see the same thing down at the resort. You're in the hospitality business, you got 1,500 employees, and so you have a turnover. You have 900 of them who are fairly stable, and then you have another 400 who are constantly turning. So what do they need? You need basic education. They just need life skills, and they need the skills. I don't know, at least in my educational experience, I was expected to be there on time, and I was expected to be in school every day, and I was expected to meet certain qualifications and demands upon me, which is what we want in the workplace. We're not, Cook has a very strict attendance policy. You can't manufacture medical devices unless people are there. And so you have to show up for work, and you have to accept responsibility for yourself. You can't come in and say, well, I've got this excuse today, because that's not acceptable. You're either there or you're not, and you're either there and ready to work or you're not.
We're not going to be here much longer. We've got about 2 minutes left, so Keith's got one more question.
This will probably be the final question that we can get to, and they both kind of deal with the economy a little bit. And one is the enormous national debt problem is a key concern of economists, politicians, and our citizens. How does this dynamic get addressed and not snowball to kill job creation and investment? And the other one dealing with the economy is, with the changing economy and the needs in education, there seems to be a resistance to education reform. They're tying education reform to economy. Please address these problems.
Lauren, would you like to take a crack at that?
I can speak to the first question, although I'm not an expert on the education question. So when people talk about our federal deficit, they often compare our federal deficit to a household budget. And this is not the way that governments work. It's never been the way that governments work, and it never will be. So when people talk about deficit hysteria, they don't look at the fact that, for example, maybe Jared can speak more to this than I can, but that there's been virtually no change on our bonds. There's never going to be a run from China on our debt that they hold, because a huge portion of their economy is invested in our economy. Not only is that in terms of us buying all of their goods, but also it would be like burning 3/4 of their savings. Why would they ever try to destroy the U.S. economy? It makes no sense for their economy, because it would kill theirs as well. So, some of the the issues that have been politicized about the deficit, I think, are very much misleading, I guess. And there's no indication that the I think that the U.S. deficit is a long-term problem and needs to be addressed. But almost all of our deficit going into the future is created by rising health costs. If we don't deal with our rising health care costs, we will never be able to address our deficit issues. So cutting all of these small programs that, like for example, Social Security, which contributes in no way to our federal deficit because it's totally self-funded, in no way addresses our deficit issues in the long term. It's all about healthcare costs. So right now, because we have this recession and this jobless recovery, what we really need to do is provide jobs to create an upward spiral as opposed to the downward spiral I mentioned earlier. And if we do that, that will address a huge part of our deficit issues in the long term, and the other part is healthcare.
We have about 15 seconds left. Anybody else want to piggyback on that?
Again, I'm not an economist. I know just enough to be a little bit dangerous, but I know that the biggest threat coming from deficits for the economy is really about the availability of resources for other things. If we continue to increase the amount of resources in the economy that go to pay the federal government's debt, there are just less resources available for other things that are necessary, whether it's education, whether it's investing in businesses, whatever it is. That's why it is a concern, not necessarily disagreeing with anything that Lauren just said. It's just when you look at the structural elements within the economy that seem to be working against bringing that deficit down, it's something that needs serious, thoughtful engagement from across society to figure out how we're going to bring those things back in balance so that when the innovation is there, the resources are there to support it with all the benefits that come from that.
Steve, we're out of time, but it's 10 seconds. I'll
10
be a good guy.
seconds, I'll say
I
three
know.
things. The deficit is one figure in about 15 trillion. The unfunded liabilities is over 100 trillion. So if you want to add up the 100 trillion, you started out with 50 employees paying for each retiree. By 2030, we're going to be at 2.3. So everybody working is you're going to have two people supporting somebody on retirement. Healthcare went exactly the wrong way. They went into how you pay rather than delivery. And they should have spent their time and effort on the delivery system. Getting everybody primary care. You can take the Cook model of put 50,000 clinics like that, and then for $12 to $15 billion, you give everybody free primary care. And that is really where they should have started. It was on the delivery system. They went on the payment system. And it's a downhill system. It's not
We
going
could
to work.
spend another hour on healthcare, but maybe we'll do that next year. Let's hear it for our panel. Aren't they terrific?